Who was Luke? Who was this person who wrote 25% of the New Testament? It's the same person who wrote Luke and Acts, first of all. There are things that show you that, of which the most significant is the echo at the beginning of Acts from the beginning of Luke. In my first book, Theophilus, I wrote about all that Jesus began to do and teach, says the author of Acts. And the book of Acts echoes the dedication to Theophilus at the beginning of Luke's Gospel, where it's clear that it's the same person being addressed, and the Acts one echoes and says, and now I'm going to tell you the next part of the story. Interesting, isn't it, that Luke says, I talked about what Jesus began to do and teach. The implication is that the book of Acts is about what Jesus now continues to do and teach. So who is Luke? One of the key clues are a number of passages in Acts where Luke speaks of himself and puts himself in the story. He says, we did this. We went to this place. We went to that place. They start in Acts chapter 16, where Luke engages with Paul for the first time. And so we get in 16:11, we set sail from Troas and made a straight course to Samothrace, the following day to Neapolis, and so on. And dotted through the rest of Acts, we've got a number of these so-called we passages. So what's the author of Acts saying by including these passages? The most natural explanation is to say he's saying, I was there. He's drawing on his own experience and his own experience of travelling with Paul. Now, others have tried to suggest different explanations for those we passages. One of the most popular ones until recently was that this was a convention used in sea voyages. And the people who noticed this, notably a scholar called Vernon Robbins, noticed that when ancient sea voyages are described, they're often written in the first person plural. We did this, we went to that place, and so on. And a lot of the we passages in Acts are like that. However, there are two things to notice. The first is that in ancient stories, sea voyages aren't always written in the first person plural. A number of them are written in the third person. They did this, they did that, they did the other. And equally, large chunks of the we passages in Acts are not sea voyages. They're about things that happen on land. So it's too simple to say that they're just sea voyage passages. The simplest explanation is either that the author of Acts has got a diary from somebody who travels with Paul, or is somebody who travels with Paul himself. Here's the interesting thing. Luke's never named in the book of Acts. So if we're to work out who the we is, we need to eliminate from Acts the people who are named as Paul's travel companions. And as you slim that list down and down and down, Luke is the one name that emerges as a possibility. What else do we know about Luke? Well, in Colossians 4:14, we're told that Luke is the beloved physician. He's a doctor, a medical doctor, and that's been a factor that's played in that. In 2 Timothy, towards the end, again, Paul says, Luke is with me. And if this letter's genuine, then it's from very near the end of the life of Paul when he's probably in prison in Rome. So there you've got two clues from Paul's letters that there's someone called Luke who travels around with him. From the earliest days of the Christian church, the only name that's ever been attached to the Gospel and to Acts is Luke. So it looks as though that's the person we're talking about. He travels around with Paul for part of the time, but not all of the time. Now, if that's the case, what does that imply about how he got his information? Clearly, the large part of Acts about Paul from chapter 13 onwards could come from either Luke's own experience of being there or Luke's conversations with Paul. What about the earlier parts of Acts? Well, there's a 2-year period when Paul is in prison in Caesarea. Caesarea is on the coast of Palestine. And there, it's in the middle of one of these we passages. So when Paul's in prison there in Caesarea, Luke has the possibility of travelling around. And it's highly likely, if Luke is Paul's travelling companion, that he would have used the opportunity to do some of the research for his Gospel and his book of Acts then. It's very likely that he would have interviewed some of the earliest members of the Christian church and got information about the early days of the book of Acts. It's very likely he would have got the stories about Jesus' birth from members of his family, and the stories of his trip to Jerusalem that's in Luke 2 from members of his family. So if Luke is Paul's travelling companion, that 2-year period provides him with the most brilliant opportunity to do the research that allows him to draw the material together for his gospel. And it allows him to collect the stories in the book of Acts for the period when he's not around. Because as far as we can see, Luke comes from Antioch. He's a Gentile. He's come to a Christian faith not from a Jewish background. Although by the time he writes Luke and Acts, he knows the scriptures really, really well. There are not only quotations from scripture, but there are echoes of scripture and phrases that are biblical phrases that make it sound like the way somebody speaks who really knows his Bible. That's made some people wonder if Luke himself might be Jewish. But if Luke's become a Christian in somewhere in the 40s AD and is writing his book of Acts around 80, then he's been a Christian for quite a long time. He's got to know Scripture really well. And he can now draw on those years and years of experience to show how Scripture's being fulfilled in the things that he's writing. The picture of Paul in Acts is an issue that's been a real matter of debate among scholars. People have looked at the picture of Paul in Acts and said, well, this doesn't sound terribly like the picture of Paul that we get in the letters. So, for instance, they look at the picture in Acts 17, where Paul in Athens argues for the creation of the world as pointing to God for people, whereas in Romans chapter 1, he seems to read the creation of the world as pointing to God, but argues that people have rejected it. So can we fit these two together? Can we fit the pictures of Paul in Acts and the letters together? One really important clue is to ask what kind of Paul they're both portraying. In the letters of Paul, Paul is writing to people who are believers in Jesus. He's writing to them, engaging with the issues that are facing them. In Corinth, for instance, in 1 Corinthians, we know that he's replying to some issues in a letter. So that in chapter 7, verse 1, he says, now, about the matters you wrote to me about. And then every so often through the rest of the letter, you'll see the phrase now concerning or now about. And there he seems to be picking up issues that they've written to him about. That's very typical of Paul's letters. They are letters engaging with particular situations and trying to help Christian people think through and understand and live as Christians in their culture with the particular issues they're facing and the particular questions those situations are raising. Look at the picture of Paul in Acts and you get a very different picture. And that's because in Acts, we're mostly listening to Paul engaging with people who are not Christians. The speeches in Acts that Paul has are virtually all engaged with people who are not yet believers and trying to persuade them to become believers, such as the one in the synagogue in Antioch in chapter 13, or the one to the pagans of Acts 17 in Athens. The other type of speeches we get are judicial speeches, such as the ones in the later part of Acts, Acts 22, Acts 26, where Paul is defending himself before a court. Now, Paul being Paul, he's going to talk about Jesus. But the focus of the speech is speaking in a courtroom, is engaging